Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back. This is another Red Pill Religion podcast, Red Pill Religion, where we say that taking the red pill is about looking for the truth and leading wherever the truth takes you. You aren't a free thinker if you auto-dismiss ideas. So please support our work on redpillreligion.com, where you'll see we post daily videos and articles, and we're always open for submissions and suggestions. You'll find our maker support, Bitcoin, and PayPal donate buttons there. So please give us your financial as well as your spiritual support. Please give us a thumbs up and a subscribe here on YouTube. And please tell your friends or enemies all about us. Now, today we're honored. We have a gentleman we'll be interviewing from the GC Science group. Now, GC Science is a fairly well-known Facebook group. It stands for Grace Chapel Science, from what I understand, because the GC Science group is for a group of Christians who like science and who are really into science, which is a natural, normal thing for Christians to be interested in, by the way. Religious people tend to be very good at science, contrary to popular rumor. Joining with me today is, actually, I don't know if he's the only guy behind it or what, but at least one of the guys behind GC Science, which is a neat guy, Karma James Carrier. Say hello to everybody today, Karma.
Hello, everybody. My name's Karma.
It's interesting that we've got I assume you're a Christian. We got a Christian named Karma. How did that come about?
Well, that's a very, very, very good question. Well, it turns out, if you want the short story, and it's a question I get asked a lot, but it turns out that my parents were hippies. So I am, in fact, an honest-to-goodness hippie love child. And like every good, hippie love child, I rebelled against the hippie establishment and became a Christian.
And in case anybody doesn't know, karma is a concept you find more in Hinduism and Buddhism, I guess. But that's not surprising. Hippies used to be into those Eastern religions and stuff. Some still are. Some still are. So, Karma, I also understand you are a molecular biologist. Is that correct?
That is correct. I've got a PhD in molecular biology, so my background is in virus replication and viral oncology.
Well, that's interesting. How did you get into that? What actually got you interested in that, friend?
What got me into that? I guess it's a long road. I think since I was a child, I was always interested in science. I worked I grew up on a farm, I guess you would say, an orchard, and a lot of plants around. So I've always been interested in agricultural science and things like that. So growing up, I think I've always wanted to work on plants. Going through school, I took genetics. I think then I got my PhD. It's actually in agricultural virus, a plant virus. Started working on those, but there wasn't a lot of jobs other than doing GMO manufacturing and research. So I decided to switch into medical research because I had a virus background. I switched over quite easily into viruses that cause tumors and cancers and things like that. So that's where I went into. Yes.
Interesting. Now, here's the question. You do this. Is your group secretly a young earth creationist group trying to sneak the Bible into science?
No, actually, quite the opposite. We would follow something called evolutionary creationism. If there was a word that would describe our overall beliefs, that would be it. I mean, as a biologist, believe it or not, just back up a little bit. I used to actually be an atheist, as a biologist when I started my graduate work. So I was a strong atheist, believed heavily in evolution, have no problems with that. The one thing I disagreed with on the atheism front was that, that science, especially evolution, went against Christianity. I guess the Christians I was studying with and talking to, they mentioned to me that evolution and the Bible weren't necessarily in conflict. It also depends on how you would try to interpret the Bible. The Bible doesn't really speak about evolution, doesn't speak so much on origins other than, say, the fact that God created the universe. So there really is no conflict between the two. It's perfectly reasonable to believe in or be a Christian and believe in evolution.
And one of the things that bothers me about that, and by the way, I hadn't known that about you, Karma. You used to be an atheist?
That is correct. Yeah, I used to be an atheist.
Was that something like, okay, your parents were, let's just turn to that, because this is also just interesting. I'm always happy
Yeah.
when I get to talk to another former atheist, because
Mhm.
former atheists have conversations that nobody else has. It's quite remarkable.
It is.
And I was one for the longest time. I still maintain friendships and talk regularly with people of non-Christian religions. It's not a problem for me. Um, why do you think you were an atheist? That's
You know,
actually, by the way, I can show you studies on that. It's not normal for a child to be an atheist. It really isn't.
yeah, I think as a child, I never really thought of, anything one way or the other. I think as my mother was, well, I used to think of her as a Christian, kind of in a new age sort of way, very earthy, crunchy. I guess my father was not very spiritual. I tended to, read a lot of books by writers like, this is going back into like the 80s and 90s and things like that. And I used to read books by a lot of people like Carl Sagan, who was kind of a hero of mine growing up. He was kind of a very, thought of religion as kind of a very primitive way of looking at things. I used to read books by, early works by Richard Dawkins, stuff like The Selfish Gene and Extended Phenotype, and,
Oh,
read things by Francis Crick and James Watson, who they're very strong. So a lot of the molecular biologists, a lot of the scientists that I was exposed to, at least the celebrity ones, were very, anti-religion. They portrayed religion as being a very primitive, kind of backwards way of thinking. I also at the time would have identified as being a Marxist. This is being up in Canada, where
oh,
where Marxism wasn't really frowned upon. So I would have identified as a Marxist, and most Marxists at the time tended to promote what they called a very scientific outlook, which was very anti-religious. So I would say I kind of viewed myself as an atheist from those perspectives.
that's interesting. I did not know you were Canadian. As it happens, I know a lot of people with Canadian backgrounds for a wide variety of reasons. I am not Canadian, but in fact, I know so many Canadians and have been involved in so many things in Canada. People often think I'm a Canadian. But Canada, the Canadian education system is big on indoctrinating atheism into the children. Well, at least on at the college level, and I think we're seeing it at high school level these days too. And when people ask me what is indoctrination in atheism, for starters, you get told all the things that he just said, that there's no rational evidence for God, that science has shown we have no need for God, that science is better than religion somehow, which is a whole. They get taught these things, and they get taught really false things about Christian history too, and religious history generally. I did you find that to be so when you were growing up in the Canadian school system?
Well, to be honest, growing up, I never thought about it that way. I just thought that's the way it was. I mean, I guess you were absolutely correct. That's what they taught you. They taught, religion's backwards. That's bigoted. They're, that sort of a progressive world view is very anti-religious. That, we're trying, religion is something that's dying and getting rid of it. And that was something I found growing up. I never thought of it at the time as being indoctrination, but, I guess now looking back on it, certainly I would definitely agree with what you're saying.
Well, a lot of it seems to have come in through cultural Marxism, and one of the things I know, this is going to get political, but it does matter. I mean, quite a few communists in the United States left the United States between the 50s and, let's say, the early 80s, and a lot of them went up into Canada and got into government up there, thinking they were going to make a workers' paradise out of Canada. And I mean, this is where you get people like Justin Trudeau ultimately. And whether you like Trudeau or not, it's just kind of what happened. But what seems to have happened is that Canadians just get indoctrinated in Marxist history. Marxist history, which you can show is wrong, because Marxist history is based on this dialectic of everything that just came out of your mouth. That religion and conflict are the religion and science are in conflict. We have science now, so we don't need religion. A lot of phony history about the supposed atrocities committed by Christians with no balance given to that. And it's all sourceable from Marxist sources, I generally find. And I'm not even sure what to do with that except to start pushing back against it and start telling people, hey, no, look, this isn't what the history is. Heck, you're a molecular biologist. Okay. When I hear somebody tell me biology, I immediately think of Louis Pasteur. the guy who gave us the whole germ theory of disease. And
Yeah.
quite a few other things. A very devout Christian, actually. In fact, a devout rosary praying Catholic, amongst other things. And he's one of the most important figures in the biological sciences in all of history, isn't he?
Oh yes, very much so. I mean, Louis Pasteur, a very strong Christian and probably one of the biggest names in biology. But I think if you look, at the history of biology, I think you'll find that actually most of the, and also, other fields of science, but most of the biggest names in science actually were Christians who were, driven by their faith or inspired by their faith to seek out laws of nature. And I think just in biology alone, you have people like Gregor Mendel, who was the founder of the field of genetics. He was an, Augustine monk. You get even today, like molecular biologists. You think of Francis Collins, who was the guy who led the Human Genome Project. I'm a very, very strong, evangelical Christian. So I think throughout science, you get everyone from, looking at physics. You get Sir Isaac Newton's probably the greatest scientist of all time. I mean, he invented the field of physics, invented calculus. He did not even consider himself a scientist. He considered himself more of a theologian and wrote more books about God than he did about science. List goes on. Galileo, Copernicus, very strong Christian reformers from the late, medieval period. Sir Francis Bacon, who was the founder of the scientific method. He was a very devout Christian. List just goes on and on and on. I'm thinking, George Lemaitre, who discovered the Big Bang, was a Catholic priest. So there's pretty much every major field of science, owes something to Christianity.
Oh, it does. The organized Christian church created the university system. It actually, really, all the 40 of the oldest universities in Europe were founded by the church. And when the Protestants came along, Protestants founded many of them. The whole peer review system was created by them. Even the way we break out the sciences into various categories just had its roots in Christian history. And one of the things I've noticed, I don't know if you want to get drawn into this controversy, but one of the things I noticed is that scientific naturalists started propping up in the sciences, in the hard sciences, and the biological sciences in the 1970s, roughly, 60s, 70s, especially with the entry of guys like Carl Sagan on the popular scene and other people like that. And scientific naturalism these days, I remember when they started talking about naturalism, and then over the last few decades, this thing has morphed to just sort of assume scientific naturalism is science. And that some are even calling methodological naturalism, and they're saying that's all science is or ever has been. And I've got a real problem with that attitude. I don't know about you. Because my read of the history is that scientific naturalists have produced very little in terms of, I don't mean everyday science, but I mean in terms of breakthrough, cutting edge science. Scientific naturalists seem like they take credit for things they didn't do. Do you know what I mean there?
Oh, I think you're definitely right. I mean, I think most studies have shown, even today, that the majority of scientists actually believe in God or a higher power, and only 17% identify as atheists. And that number's pretty much had steady for decades. And I think what it is you do see the atheist community, they really need to hang their hat onto something. I mean, Christians got the Bible, they got years of faith and history. They need to have something that they can hang on to. So they really tend to promote science as being, well, that's theirs. And they do try to own it, but they really are just standing on the back of centuries of Christianity. There have always been atheists. I mean, there's been atheists around since like Roman times or Greek times.
Oh, sure.
But none of them have invented science. None of them actually, atheism never came out of, or science never came out of atheism. It only came out of Christianity, because Christianity is a worldview that, predicts laws in nature. And the reason they do that, predict laws in nature, is because they expect someone there to be a lawgiver. Atheism makes no such claim. So I think it was recently they said, well, we really need something to support our views. And I think that's why you see a lot of them clinging to science.
But it really doesn't make sense. In fact, you said something there that I think is really worth knowing. At the root of classical Christianity, By which I mean, the kind that went on to form universities and formalize the sciences and mathematics and philosophy and spread universal education and all that stuff. That kind of Christianity is not the kind of Christianity that basically sits at home with a Bible and reads it and says, "I believe everything in this," and the end. That's not that. That's not the kind of. I'm not saying those are bad Christians. I'm saying that's not the kind of Christian that created the education system and the science system. The kind of Christians who did that believed, amongst other things, that Jesus was something called the divine logos. And without getting too deep into it, what they believed as a result of that and things that the Bible said was that there were laws of nature which would be fixed and unchanging. Which, if there's laws of nature that are fixed, unchanging, predictable, and understandable, well, that's an axiomatic assumption you need for most to even do most science, isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, science rests upon certain assumptions, and those are that you can make measurements, of things in the universe, that you can, or in whether it be studying cells, or you be studying stars, or you be studying geology. The prelude is that you're always going to be able to measure something and be able to report a difference, and that's basically what the scientific method is. And to have something that's consistently reportable and measurable, you do need laws of science.
And the truth is there's no, actually, I'll put this out there, and it's very true, by the way. There is no scientific proof for the idea that the laws of nature are fixed. There's no scientific, there's no scientific proof that math always works to describe the universe either.
I guess you could say that that is true to an aspect. I mean, there are predictions you can make and things, things that are,
sure.
Most science is based on math, but yeah, there is no proof that math is the only way to do things. Absolutely.
Well, right. Well, no, I even like to point out there may be, it's kind of a faith assumption you make that everything will even be analyzable by math. I'm not even saying it's not true, but it is an assumption. It's an axiomatic assumption that the math will work. You can't like design an experiment to falsify math, I don't think.
Well, and an interesting thing about the math is that math can give you a lot of different outcomes. You can have math results. You'll have a positive and a negative result, and in experimentally, of course, you'll know that to rule out one of the possibilities. But a lot of atheist assumptions and things like that are just based on theory, where they haven't had experimental results that can disprove their results. So they're going on things that are hypothetical, just as much a faith position as anything else.
Well, there's the thing. I've even had them try to suggest there's no such thing as an atheist assumption, but of course there is. If you don't think there's a God or something very close to the idea of God, and if you also don't believe there's anything what we would classically have called supernatural, then most of your beliefs are going to be very predictable. You're going to believe that intelligence can arise out of out of an unintelligent universe. You're going to believe there is no afterlife, or probably isn't one. You're going to wind up believing that meaning and purpose are things they're basically human delusions. You're going to wind up with all those positions. And what I like to point out is that if you take all that and some of the other things that are natural to the atheist assumption, there's no proof science works at all. I mean, we can't prove anything. There's no objectivity. There's no ultimate truth. There's no ultimate meaning. Everything's relative to everything else. You're begging for incoherence in your worldview there.
Well, I think what I would say is there's nothing in science that says that atheism is true. I mean, you could say that according to science, we don't have concrete evidence in the existence of God. We can agree with that. But on the other hand, we don't have concrete evidence that atheism is true. I would say in terms of that, concepts like atheism and theism are kind of metaphysical concepts. They're really beyond the ability of science to comment on. And I think what an atheist tends to do is they kind of look at one side of the argument and say, look, there's no evidence for God, therefore, or there's no evidence that a God created the universe, therefore God does not exist. But I think the truth is that science, as I said, it's just measurements. We can say, yes, that is true. But we also have to say that we don't have evidence that there is an atheistic worldview is true. We don't know that there is a non-divine, ultimately a non-intelligent cause to the universe. We just cannot comment on that. So, I mean, science can either say something is, yes, it's true, or you say it's no, or it's false, or we just don't know yet. I think what we can say about science in regards to atheism and theism, we really don't know what the ultimate answer is, whether God exists or whether he does not exist. We don't know. So no matter what you believe, whether it be atheism or a theistic view, it is a belief that must be based on faith.
And there's a lot of faith positions that come with it. I don't entirely agree with you, however, because I think it always depends on what you mean by science. If you're in the most classical worldview, you're absolutely correct, because historically the natural sciences were really very well defined. The natural sciences would look at that which is physical and would leave other fields for non-physical things. But these days we accept as science all kinds of things which do not have material, substance. For example, the entire subject of the entire field of economics, which is held by many to be a science, has nothing physical it's measuring at all. It's all numbers and it's all theory, and it does make predictions, but they're not measuring anything physical. If we get to something more specific, Jeffrey Long and a few others have published peer-reviewed medical tracking surveys of near-death experience patients using to the same level of standard and rigor that you would use in drug trials or in testing various psychological or even surgical interventions. It's as rigorous as anything you'd find in those fields. It's not measuring anything physical. Yet, you look at what he's got there in that data set, and it's just overwhelming. Most of the explainer wayers of near-death experience cannot be supported in the current scientific data. And that data overwhelmingly suggests there has to be some kind of awareness outside of the physical body, that our awareness does appear to go on after we're dead. And that is what I would call scientific evidence. I mean, it's never going to be your perfect proof, I guess, because you can always take it apart. But there is that. And when you look in physics, when you look at cosmology, you look at the cosmological constant and the Big Bang, both point right at something ultimate causing and continuing to make the universe go the way it does. I've heard there's stuff in genetics that people are pointing to, but we have multiple areas of science that are pointing right at a guiding intelligence running things that are hard to explain away in a simple, dumb universe, a causeless, random universe.
Well, what I would say in a case like this, I certainly think of the existence of God or belief in God is certainly consistent with our understanding of science, and I think that's one of the beautiful things. I think genetically, humans are certainly hardwired for religious faith, and I think as such, I think belief in God, for most cases, is a natural part of being human. And I personally don't see any reason why someone should, reject a belief in God unless there is hard evidence to suggest that God, is, incompatible with our understanding of the universe. And it most certainly is not. So I really can't see of anyone making a claim, supporting a scientific claim that God does not exist. I would not agree with any atheist argument with that. Comments about, near-death experiences, I think those are a little beyond my understanding or my area of expertise as a molecular biologist. But, certainly I think there is a lot of, evidence out there that is quite, or a lot of scientific data that is quite consistent with the existence of God. And I see no reason to reject belief in God, from any point of view such as that. So
yeah, I would point out to people, as I often have, that researchers like Justin L. Barrett and others have done extensive documentation on this. And while there are exceptions, the vast majority of children develop a sense of God and the supernatural between the ages of 2 and 4. Sometimes they lose it when they get older, but most of them do not. And it's not specific. They don't show up at the age of 3 and say, I think I want to, I'm into Jesus and I want a Bible or whatever, or I'm going to be a Muslim. They don't do that, right? But they have this natural sense that something supernatural must exist and that something is ultimately running things. And the children can distinguish it just fine from Santa Claus and imaginary friends. They already know the difference. So it is natural to believe something like this. And that always leads me to the question, why would we have evolved a sense like that made no sense at all?
Well,
Evolutionarily, why would we develop that?
or what was that last bit? I didn't quite hear that. Sorry. Evolution what?
Why,
Oh, why would we
evolutionary,
develop it? Yeah.
why would we develop this massive delusion that there's something intelligent running things and that there may be spirit forces we can't see that matter, call them demons or spirits or whatever you want. Those are natural things for kids to conclude probably exist. I mean, they like have an innate understanding of the idea, pretty much like they understand what colors are or what words are. It seems to be a natural development. There's no society that's ever evolved that doesn't have this. Why would we evolve a delusion like that? And
Yeah.
a delusion that is supposedly, because whenever I hit this question with an atheist, they'll try to say, well, because it was fun, it helped us for group survival strategy or whatever. But then I point out, but then you're always saying that religion is what messes everybody up and destroys society and makes everything bad. So religion is this natural thing we develop, which is a delusion, which is extraordinarily dangerous, even though it helped our survival.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying makes perfect sense. I mean, nothing in biology makes sense outside of evolution. I mean, evolution is kind of the thing that holds, any biological science together. If you really want to understand biology, you need to understand evolution. And, looking into that, I mean, you made a very good point, which is that, humans are hardwired for faith. Belief in God is a natural part of being human, so why do we believe that? And there really is no good atheist answer. And I said, back, as a young molecular biologist, that was one of the challenges I had, is that, everyone, atheist community said, well, religion is this, it's a virus of the mind, belief in God's a virus of the mind, it's a delusion, it's this, it's something that's, it's only programmed into you. But no, people are hardwired for this. I mean, no matter, you get these militant atheist countries, governments, things like the Soviet Union or China, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, you name it. They've been trying to stamp out religious views for decades. And, it's like playing whack-a-mole. No matter how hard they program people, no matter how hard they indoctrinate them, they give people death sentences, they threaten them with torture. No matter what, people will still believe in these kind of things. It's not something you can eradicate. It's something that's it's a natural part of being human. And so why did we evolve that? And like you said, atheists can't come up with a real straight answer. They say it's I've heard of everything from an artifact, or it's a mistake of evolution, which doesn't make sense because they say evolution is the natural way to go. It's a mistake or it's a survival thing, but then they bounce it off with saying it's a bad thing. So none of these things, they don't have a good answer. The only good answer that I could come up with is that, evolution was built into us, billions of years ago, as it were, as part of an evolutionary process. So there's got to be something behind that wants us to seek it out. So the question is, why do we have this evolutionary, why do we have this need to seek out a creator? Why does the universe give rise to intelligent life that seeks out a creator? And that is a real big question. I think that and just about anything else really points, to there being a God. It gives justification for it.
I have something you might like. I have a one-liner that tends to cut through a lot of people who are confused. Mind you, the committed hardcore, convinced atheist is never gonna, but I find a lot of people are confused. I find this line is very helpful. I say God is the intelligence that's operating the laws of physics and probability. Literally, it's the intelligence underlying those things. That's what the idea of God is. And once you understand that God is responsible for, is running, let's put it to you this way, is running the laws of probability in physics, you pretty much can see immediately, well, how could it be in conflict with science then?
Yeah,
it can't.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, like I said, I was always told that science and Christian faith were in conflict, and then when I went to prove that or demonstrate it or confirm it, I found that it really fell apart really quickly. A lot of these atheist assumptions, at least the ones I had, didn't make a lot of sense in the light of what they claim. Is that the science and faith are perfectly symbiotic with each other.
Yeah, in fact, from that position, honestly, science is a faith-based endeavor. It is. Because it always does wind up resting on faith axioms that by its own toolkit it can't prove. Just going back
Well,
to...
what I would
Go ahead.
Yeah, what I would say for that is I think it takes a lot of science, or sorry, it takes a lot of faith to live as a scientist. What faith is. I mean, when it comes down to it, if you look at the dictionary definition of faith, faith is just simply believing in something that you don't have proof or concrete evidence to be true. And as a scientist, we're always making predictions, and we're always coming up with our pet theories that, I think this is going to be true or that's going to be true. We don't have a shred of evidence to support any of these views that we come up, all these interesting hypotheses. Now we try to seek out evidence afterwards. But, a lot of times as scientists, you spend years trying to, working on a pet hypothesis that you hope is true, that you're trying to convince other people to give you grant money that's true. You're trying to, you're just trying to, convince other people to share your faith in that sense. And you spend oftentimes years, there are scientists who spend years trying to find evidence to support some of their pet hypotheses. I mean, that takes a lot of faith to live that way.
Oh, it does. And like I say, if you assume that the laws of physics don't just randomly change and fluctuate all over the place, if you assume everything is amenable to logical analysis and mathematics and testing, these are all just faith assumptions. I mean, they're axioms you need to work with as a scientist, and they're almost certainly true. But really, can I prove that the laws of physics don't shift randomly out there in the cosmos? How would I know?
Yeah. Well, and I think a big mistake people make is they think, a lot of people I speak to really have a misunderstanding of how science works. I mean, science doesn't really go around proving theories. You never prove a theory. You never prove a hypothesis. The scientific method is a subtractive process. You basically start with a whole bunch of assumptions, and then you start falsifying them. So it's a falsification process. You start with a theory or start with a hypothesis. You try to falsify it. It doesn't work, so you modify your theory a little bit. You try to falsify it again. You keep falsifying. So what you end up doing is kind of characterizing this hypothesis in more detail, but you never prove it. I think Albert Einstein, or somebody who attributed to Albert Einstein anyways, has claimed that you can never prove a theory even with 100 experiments, but you can always disprove it with just one.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about science, actually. It can overturn itself at any time. I mean, the more well-established something is, it's less likely it's going to be to overturn, but it can be. You're never sure 100% with science, because you can't be.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I like about Christianity. I mean, as a scientist, I mean, every other, faith position, whether it be, Islam, Buddhism, or, especially like with my former faith, which was atheism, these all make kind of assumptions about the universe that are really untestable. And there's no way to falsify any of these things. Because in science, we like to have hypotheses that are easily falsifiable. But none of these other faiths, are falsifiable. They make claims that just can't be tested. The good thing about Christianity is it stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. And I think that is something that can be easily falsified. All you have to do to falsify Christianity is account for Jesus' body. Do that, and Christianity's proven wrong, and we can all go do something else. But the thing is, for thousands of years now, at least 2,000 years, the critics of Christianity, whether it be the Romans or, the, ancient Israel, or whether it be the, Muslims or atheists today, they've been trying to falsify the resurrection, like I said, for thousands of years and have not been able to do it. The more attempts you try to falsify it and you fail, the, more credibility that hypothesis gets.
Yeah, if you're interested in the specific evidence of Jesus, by the way, here on Red Pill Religion, we talk to people of all religions. Okay, we don't do Christian apologetics here, except if it comes up on accident, right? And we bring in Jews, we've brought in witches, we talk to all kinds of people. But I would point out that if you want to start looking at the evidence for Jesus, first off, don't believe guys like Richard Carrier, but pick up books like Cold Case Christianity by J. Werner Wallace, or The Case for Christ by
Lee Strobel.
Yeah, read those guys, and you'll at least know what the archaeological and forensic evidence we have is for the existence and even for the resurrection of Jesus. We have that evidence, and and while certainly occasionally Christians have thought something was evidence and it wound up debunked, most of it's never been debunked. We really do have a lot of evidence for this this person and these events that were described. And we got a lot of historical evidence too. So I will pitch those out as book references. But we're running a little low on time, and I didn't get to ask you this, Karma. What made you change your mind and decide there was a God? And for that matter, what made you change your mind and decided not only do I think there's a God, I think I want to be a Christian? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it all started when I was in grad school, and I think at the time I was doing a comprehensive exam, which is you have to basically stand up on this panel, and that's kind of the weeding out process for a PhD program. They kind of hit you with all kinds of questions, and one of the people asked me a question, and I answered it wrong, and they said basically, what you're saying is based on what you understood about viruses from watching some science fiction movie that was out at the time, and you really need to test your assumptions. And so what I did is I said, oh, yeah, that's great. I'll go around and started testing all my assumptions from a scientific point of view. And I was reading a book by Richard Dawkins, and I started disagreeing with some of his conclusions at the time. I thought, well, how do I know atheism is correct? So I began probably a fairly lengthy process of questioning atheism. And I found that, atheism really was no more different than any other faith. It really was a position based on faith, and there's really nothing scientific to support it. So I thought, well, maybe I should be more open-minded and start checking out all these other faiths. And I did. I looked at, things like Islam and Buddhism and whatever. And I think there's one group of people on campus who were always inviting me out to do things. And these were Christians, a bunch of crazy guys. But they were fun to hang out with and spend time talking to them. And I, through looking at all the faiths, I just basically realized that, these guys are nice. They're fun to be around. What they're saying is completely consistent with science. So I'll explore that and just never really look back.
That makes perfect sense. And it's funny because I've talked to more than one scientist. I've talked to Sarah Salviander, an astrophysicist who grew up in Canada, indoctrinated an atheist her whole life, and wound up in her 20s while she was studying science at university, realizing, I think there's a God. In fact, I'm positive there's one. And that was just looking at the science she was doing. And what she said was, it was she's an astrophysicist now. She said, looking at the orderly intelligibility of the universe and the way it all just hung together and the way it was all intelligible and predictable to us, there was just no way this wasn't, something bigger, something intelligent wasn't underneath this. And then she too eventually became a Christian. I got a buddy, Cy Gart. He's a biochemist. He's not a buddy. We talked quite a few times. And he was raised in a Marxist home and raised to hate religion and raised to want nothing to do with it. And he too, in his 20s, in his case it was in his 20s, started thinking, I think there's a God. He even said when he became a Christian, it was just sort of a dawning realization, I guess I am one. Through a slow process of reading and investigation. Everybody's journey is a little different, but quite a few scientists wind up where you are, Karma. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of, it's funny, I think a lot of people who are atheists actually go into sciences. I do see a lot of my atheist friends became Christians. I think like myself became a Christian, and I see a lot of atheists in science becoming, coming to believe in God. I actually don't see a lot of, Christians actually becoming atheists while they're, who actually started out as scientists. It's usually the other direction, which is quite interesting.
What's that now? I guess I didn't catch that.
Oh, it's like I see a lot of atheist scientists become Christian, but I don't see a lot of Christian scientists becoming atheists.
Yeah, it's pretty common to go into the sciences, especially if you're in an area dominated by the naturalists and already be an atheist, especially because sometimes they'll even mistreat you if you're not one. But it's very common once you're in to start questioning these things. I give it to the audience again. If something intelligent is ultimately underlying the laws of physics and probability, then you're not going to disprove God. God is what's running those things, is in charge of those things, is making them happen and making them continue to happen, which is what most serious theists believe. In fact, even non-Christian theists fundamentally believe that. I've talked to Jews and others, and they're like, yeah, it's what's making it all go. It's what's making this intelligible, observable, predictable universe intelligible to us. I mean, if you think about it, is there any reason why the universe should seem intelligible to us? I don't see why it should be. Why do we even believe that what we're seeing with our eyes and ears is true at all?
That is it. That is a big question. That is a number one question people are trying to ask, and we don't have an answer yet, so it makes sense.
Well, listen, this was all kinds of fun. Did you have anything else you wanted to mention before we close this out, Karma?
No, just to say it's great. I mean, didn't really talk much about the GC Science, which is the group that I'm the director of. It is a ministry for scientists at Grace Chapel in the Boston area. But we have a Facebook page with over 500,000 likes on it, so we have a lot of discussions. If there are Christians out there who are interested in science, I would just love to chat with you. Other than that, nothing else to add.
Okay, so GC Science is sort of like an outreach to scientists who've become who are getting interested in religion. I love it. I think what a great idea that is.
Yeah, it's fun. And anyone who has questions, it's great.
And I'll tell you what, guys, it's true. You might actually get better at your science if you become religious, and if you come to accept that there's a God, which there is, by the way. We got lots of evidence of that proposition. But it may actually improve it. A large number of scientists now are going back to things like teleology and assuming that there's purpose in nature. And when they look for purpose in nature, they start finding it, and they start finding useful things they can get out of it. So I mean, it's very, very worth listening to, looking into. Really, if you're into science because you're into ideas, come explore these ideas. They're not primitive. And they're not superstitious, and they're not a threat to your ability to do science or math or any of that. All right, everybody. Well, I want to thank Karma Carey for being on here. I think we might ask him to come on again sometime. Please do check out the GC Science group on Facebook and the Grace Chapel GC Science website, which is www.grace.org, grace.org, grace.org. And otherwise, well, please give us a like, please give us a subscribe, and God bless everybody.